There is a grief that does not move. Most grief moves slowly, painfully in its own time, but it moves, it shifts, it changes shape. The sharp edge eventually dulls, not because the loss becomes smaller, but because the person carrying it becomes, over years, more accustomed to the weight. But there is one kind of grief that doesn't do that. The grief of a parent who has buried a child. That grief does not move. It does not dull. It simply becomes the house you live in. The walls you wake up inside every morning. The thing that is always there. Ruth Simmons had lived inside that house for 37 years. If you have ever been told something that turned out not to be true, and if you believe that the truth, however late it arrives, is always worth arriving, hit that like button right now and subscribe. Every week we bring you stories that remind you what people are capable of surviving and what they are capable of finding on the other side. This is one of those stories. Let's go. Ruth was 74 years old when she walked onto the set of Family Feud. She was a small woman, not fragile. Small in the way that people who have been through enormous things sometimes are, concentrated, precise. Like all of her energy had been drawn inward over the years into something dense and unbreakable. She had sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, a short silver crown of natural hair, and wore a lavender blazer that her granddaughter Aisha had picked out for her and that she had put on without argument, which everyone in her family knew meant she was in a good mood. She had a warmth to her that was immediate and real, the kind that doesn't perform itself. She just had it, the way some people do, as a natural property of being in the room. She had come to Family Feud with her granddaughter Aisha, her neighbor of 30 years, Ms. Patricia Webb, her church friend Dolores, and her great-nephew Calvin, who was 22 and had been told approximately 47 times on the drive over not to say anything embarrassing on national television, a directive he would partially honor. The team was introduced, and the audience took to Ruth immediately. She had that quality, hard to name, easy to feel, of someone who has earned their age. Not just survived it, but earned it, the way you earn something by paying for it honestly over a long period of time. When Steve Harvey walked over to shake her hand in the opening segment, he held it for an extra moment and looked at her the way he looks at people when his instinct has already told him something his mouth hasn't caught up to yet. He asked her the usual warm-up questions: where she was from, what she did. She told him she was from Memphis, Tennessee, originally, though she had lived in Atlanta for the past 40 years. She told him she had been a school teacher for 33 years, 4th grade. She told him she had 3 grandchildren and that Aisha, standing beside her, was the oldest, and that Aisha had her mother's eyes. Steve asked about her children. The question was easy and conversational, the kind he asks a dozen times a day. Ruth answered it the way she had always answered it because she had had 37 years to learn how to answer it without breaking in public. She said, "I had 2 sons. My youngest, Marcus, he's in Birmingham now, does real estate, got 3 kids of his own." She paused. The pause was small and practiced. "My oldest, Darnell, I lost him in 1987. He was 22 years old." Steve nodded with the gentle respect of a man who knows not to say too much in these moments. He said, "I'm sorry." Ruth nodded back. "Thank you," she said. "It was a long time ago, but some things don't get farther away." She said it without self-pity. As a simple fact, the way you report the weather, the game began, and Ruth Simmons played Family Feud the way she had apparently done everything else in her life, with complete focus and a refusal to be rattled. She was sharp. She was quick. She talked back to the survey board when she disagreed with an answer, which made Steve laugh so genuinely it caught him off guard. She held her team together through 2 close rounds. Calvin said something moderately embarrassing exactly once, and Ruth handled it with the ease of a woman who had been managing young men her entire professional career. Ms. Patricia Webb turned out to be secretly excellent at fast money-style thinking, which she explained by saying she watched a lot of game shows and paid attention, which she said in the tone of someone who had been waiting to reveal this competency for some time. Dolores from the church was enthusiastic in a way that was entirely her own. She buzzed in twice before the question was finished, got the first one right and the second one magnificently wrong, and accepted both outcomes with equal grace, which is perhaps the highest expression of good sportsmanship available to a human being. They made it to the fast money round. Aisha would go first, then Ruth. Aisha played steadily and scored well. When Ruth stepped up to the podium for the second half, the audience was already on her side in that full, committed way that audiences reserve for people who have simply won them over without trying. Steve stood beside her, and before the clock started, he did the thing that Ruth would later describe as feeling like the floor tilted underneath her. He said, "Ms. Ruth, before we start, I want to go back to something you said earlier, about Darnell." Ruth looked at him. Her expression was careful but steady. The expression of someone who has had 37 years of practice keeping herself upright when the name comes up in unexpected places. She said, "Okay," Steve said. "You said you lost him in 1987. Can you tell me a little more about what happened?" Ruth took a breath. She said, "He was living in New Orleans at the time. He was young, you know how young men are. He was finding himself, which in 1987 for a young black man in New Orleans meant he was moving through some difficult circles. I got a call from a hospital down there. They told me he had been brought in, that he had died." She stopped, restarted. "They told me he had died. There was a mix-up with the records. We had a funeral. We buried a casket." She paused again. "I never fully believed it, a mother knows. I always felt like something was wrong, but I didn't have the money to fight it. I didn't have the connections. I was a school teacher in Atlanta raising 2 boys alone. You have to accept what you've been told, even when something in you won't quite let go." The studio was completely still. Steve Harvey stood beside her, and his face was doing something that it doesn't often do on camera. It was simply open. No hosting composure, no professional management of the moment. Just a man listening to a 74-year-old woman describe the worst thing that had ever happened to her and feeling the full weight of it. He said, "Ms. Ruth, what if I told you that the something in you that wouldn't quite let go was right?" Ruth Simmons looked at Steve Harvey for a long moment. The studio cameras caught her face in that moment, and it became, in the weeks and months after the episode aired, one of the most discussed images the show had ever produced. Because what her face showed was not one thing. It was 4 things simultaneously: hope and terror and disbelief and a fierce, trembling caution. The look of a person who has been wrong before about something this large and does not know if their heart can afford to be wrong again. She said very quietly, "What do you mean?" Steve said, "Your family reached out to us when they submitted their application for the show. Aisha included something in the notes. She told us about Darnell. She told us what you had told her, that you never fully believed it. She asked us if there was anything we could do." Aisha, standing in the family section, had both hands pressed together in front of her lips, and her eyes were bright and full. She had kept this secret for 4 months. She had carried it through the application process, through the rehearsals, through the drive to the studio, through the entire game. 4 months of knowing something her grandmother did not know and not being able to tell her, and choosing to hold it because she understood that the telling needed to happen here like this, where it could be witnessed. Steve continued, "Our team worked with a private investigator and a specialist in hospital records from the 1980s. What they found is that in 1987 there was a significant records failure at the hospital in New Orleans where Darnell was treated. Several patients were misidentified. It was not an isolated error. And in the process of that investigation, Ms. Ruth, they found something." He stopped. She said, "Say it." He said, "Darnell is alive." Ruth Simmons did not move for 3 full seconds. She stood at that podium with her hands flat on the surface, and she did not move, and she did not make a sound, and she did not look away from Steve Harvey's face, as if she were trying to determine whether the words were real or whether she had finally, after 37 years, simply begun hearing what she most wanted to hear. Then she said, in a voice so low the microphone barely caught it, "Say that again." Steve said, "Darnell is alive, Ms. Ruth. He is 59 years old. He lives in Houston, Texas. He has been looking for you." And Ruth Elaine Simmons, 74 years old, former schoolteacher, small woman in a lavender blazer chosen by her granddaughter, made a sound that had no name. It came from somewhere below language, from somewhere below composure and practice and 37 years of learning to carry something without letting it crush you. It came from the place where a mother keeps the part of herself that never stopped believing, even when she was telling herself she had to stop, even when she was accepting what she had been told, even when she was going to the cemetery and standing in front of a casket and choosing, because she had no other choice, to grieve. That part of her had never grieved. It had waited. Steve Harvey put his arm around her shoulders. He did not speak. Audience was completely silent, not the anticipatory silence of people waiting for what comes next, but the reverent silence of people who understand they are witnessing something that should not be rushed. After a long moment, Steve said softly, "He's here, Ms. Ruth. He's in the building. Do you want to see your son?" She pulled back slightly to look at Steve's face. She needed to see his eyes when she asked what she was about to ask. She said, "Is this real?" He held her gaze. He said, "It is real. I promise you, it is real." She closed her eyes. When she opened them, she looked like someone who has just made a decision about something enormous and irrevocable. She looked like someone who has decided, after 37 years, to let herself believe. She said, "Bring my son to me." Darnell Simmons walked through the side doors of that studio in a dark blue suit, and an expression on his face that no one in that room would ever find the words to adequately describe. He was 59 years old. He was tall, like the photographs his mother had kept, with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, the same sharp, seeing eyes that Ruth wore behind her wire-rimmed glasses, just set in a man's face that had accumulated 59 years of living instead of the 22 years she had last known. What had happened to Darnell in 1987 was a story that would take the full investigative segment the show devoted to it 4 months later to tell properly. The short version was this. He had been in a serious accident. He had been brought to that New Orleans hospital unconscious, without identification, misidentified in the intake process, and treated under a wrong name. When he recovered, after weeks in which he was listed under someone else's identity, during which time the confusion in the hospital records had compounded, he was told that the family listed under his actual name had been informed of his death. He was 22 years old, recovering from a serious injury, estranged from a life that had not been going well, and he made a decision that he had spent 37 years regretting. He decided not to correct it immediately. He told himself he would reach out when he was better, when he was doing better, when he had something to show for himself, when he was worthy of walking back into his mother's life. And then the years went by the way years do, and the longer the silence lasted, the more impossible it seemed to break, and the more impossible it seemed to break the longer the silence lasted. He had hired investigators twice in the last decade. He had reached out to a family reunion organization. He had been close twice, and it hadn't connected. And then a production assistant at Family Feud, following up on an unusual note in a show application submitted by a young woman named Ruth Simmons, had made a phone call that had eventually reached him in Houston on an ordinary Tuesday morning. And he had said yes before the sentence was finished. He had been in that building for 4 hours. He had watched his mother play the game on a monitor backstage, watched her talk back to the survey board, watched her manage Calvin's moment with the patient efficiency of a schoolteacher who had seen everything, and he had stood there quietly while a producer handed him a folded tissue, and he used it without embarrassment because there was nothing embarrassing about what was happening. He was watching his mother. He was watching her alive and sharp and loved and surrounded by family and wearing a lavender blazer and being exactly, completely herself. He was watching 37 years of her life that he had not been present for, compressed into 45 minutes, and it was the most painful and the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. When he walked through those doors and into the light of the studio, he saw her before she turned. He saw her from the back first, the silver hair, the set of her shoulders, the way she was standing very still, the way she always stood very still when something important was happening, a stillness he remembered from childhood with a clarity that stopped his breath. He had not known he remembered it until he saw it. She turned. It is difficult to describe what happened to Ruth Simmons's face when she saw her son for the first time in 37 years because it did not do one thing. Collapsed and rebuilt itself in the same instant. 37 years of grief and 37 years of refusal to completely let go, and one telephone call from a production assistant, and 4 months of Aisha keeping a secret, and a 74-year-old woman standing at a game show podium being told her son was alive. All of it arrived at once, and her face received it all at once, and the result was something that the cameras captured, but that no description of it will ever fully convey. She said his name, just that, just Darnell, in the voice of a mother who has not said her child's name out loud to anyone who could hear it in 37 years. He crossed the stage in a few long strides, and she walked toward him, and they met in the middle, and he put his arms around her, and she disappeared into them the way small people disappear into the embraces of people who are larger than them. And he held on like a man who has spent 37 years knowing what he gave up and is not going to let go of it again. Steve Harvey stood to the side of the stage. He was not frozen this time, the way he had frozen with the Foster sisters. He was crying. Openly, without concealing it, with one hand pressed over his heart and his eyes full and his composure entirely elsewhere. He would say later that he had hosted the show through breakups and makeups and surprise announcements and homecomings, that he had seen more than most people see in a decade of working with families. He said, "I have never stood on that stage and felt what I felt in that moment. That was a mother getting her son back from the dead. I don't have words for it. I just have gratitude that I was in the room." Aisha in the family section had completely given up composure, and so had Ms. Patricia Webb and Dolores from the church, and even Calvin, the 22-year-old who had been warned about 47 times not to say anything embarrassing, was simply standing there with tears running down his face saying nothing at all, which was perhaps the most dignified thing he did all day. Ruth and Darnell talked on that stage for a long time. The show did not cut away. The producers, who could have redirected the moment, who could have scheduled a more controlled reunion for a later segment, had instead made the right decision, the human decision, to let the moment be as long as it needed to be. What they talked about was private in the way that 37 years of accumulated conversation is private, and the show honored that by not asking them to perform it for the cameras. What was visible was enough. Two people, a mother and a son. In the same room. Eventually, Ruth pulled back and looked at his face the way she had looked at Steve Harvey's face earlier, searching for the truth of it, for the realness of it. She reached up with both hands and held his face and looked at him for a very long time. He let her look. He stayed as still as she had stood in childhood when something important was happening. She said, "You got old." He laughed. It was the first laugh, the real one. And the studio heard it, and the studio laughed with it, the way laughter works when it is the only appropriate response to the size of a thing. He said, "Mama, so did you?" She said, "I had good reason." He said, "Yes, ma'am, you did." The episode aired 6 weeks after the taping. The response was unlike almost anything the show had previously experienced. The clip of Ruth's face when Steve said the words "Darnell is alive" was shared across every platform, embedded in news articles in 14 countries, discussed in psychology publications as an example of what researchers called a grief reversal event. Something so rare that there is almost no clinical literature on it, because almost nothing in human experience corresponds to it. You grieve. You adjust. You carry. That is the expected trajectory. The unexpected one, the one where the grief turns out to have been based on a mistake, has no established roadmap. There is no cultural script for what Ruth Simmons experienced. She had to find her way through entirely new territory with her son beside her for the first time. They did it together. It was not simple. 37 years of separation does not dissolve in a studio embrace, however real and however long. There were hard conversations. There were sessions, individually and together, with a counselor who specialized in family reunification. There was grief, real, legitimate grief, for the 37 years themselves, for the time that could not be recovered, for everything that had been missed in both directions. Darnell had missed his mother's retirement from teaching. He had missed the births of her grandchildren. He had missed the death of her younger brother Thomas, whom he had loved. Ruth had missed 59 years of her son's life, had missed watching the difficult young man he had been at 22 become the steady, quiet, responsible man he was at 59, and the missing of those years was real even as the gratitude for what was present was also real. Both things were true at the same time, the joy and the grief, the reunion and the loss. People who heard the story and expected it to be simple had never had to hold two enormous opposing truths simultaneously and find a way to live inside both of them. Ruth and Darnell had to learn how, and they did. Darnell, for his part, underwent his own private reckoning. He had spent 37 years carrying the decision he made at 22, the decision not to correct the hospital's mistake immediately, to wait until he was worthy, to reach out when he had something to show for himself. The waiting had stretched into years and the years into decades, and the story he told himself about why he was waiting had changed many times, but the result was always the same. He did not reach out. He had spent thousands of hours thinking about that choice. Not in self-punishment, though there had been years of that, but eventually in something more useful in understanding. He understood now what fear does to a young person who already feels like a failure. He understood how shame convinces you that disappearing is a kindness when it is actually just fear wearing a disguise. He had done a great deal of work on that understanding. And when he finally sat across from his mother in the studio that day and she held his face in her hands, he had been ready, not because he had become perfect, but because he had become honest. He had stopped waiting to be worthy and started simply being present. That, in the end, was the whole lesson. 8 months after the taping, Ruth flew to Houston for the first time and met Darnell's family. His wife Carolyn, his 2 adult children, his 3 grandchildren who were her great-grandchildren and who called her Grandma Ruth without hesitation, with the easy warmth of children who had been told this was someone to love and had simply done it. She sat at Carolyn's kitchen table and ate a meal that Carolyn had spent 2 days preparing, and she held one of the great-grandchildren in her lap, and the child fell asleep against her chest, and she sat there very still, the way she always stood when something important was happening, and did not move for a long time because she did not want to disturb the sleeping child or the moment or the specific grace of sitting in a kitchen in Houston, Texas. Holding a child she did not know existed 6 months ago, Darnell came to Atlanta for Thanksgiving that year. He sat at his mother's table. He met Marcus, the younger brother who had grown up believing he was the only one left, who had received the call from Aisha 6 months earlier with a silence so long that Aisha had thought the call had dropped. and who now sat across the table from his brother for the first time in 37 years, and said very little during the meal because he was working through something that required most of his interior attention. Afterward, the two brothers sat on Ruth's back porch in the Atlanta night and talked for 3 hours. What they talked about was between them. Ruth spoke in an interview given 6 months after the episode aired about what she wanted people to take from her story. She said, "I want them to know 2 things. The first is if something and you won't let go, trust it. Don't let the world talk you out of what you know. A mother knows. I always knew something was wrong. I couldn't prove it. I didn't have the resources to fight it, but I knew. And I was right, so trust what you know." She paused. "The second thing is it is never too late. 37 years. I was 74 years old, and my son came back. So whatever you think is too far gone, whatever you think is too broken to fix, whatever you have accepted that maybe you should not have accepted, I am proof that the door can open again. Even after 37 years, even after a funeral, even after everything." Steve Harvey referenced Ruth's story in his opening monologue on multiple occasions in the year that followed. He spoke about it when he was asked, in interviews, what had changed him in his years of hosting. He said, "Ruth changed me. Watching that woman stand at my podium and hear that her son was alive, I have never been more certain of anything in my career than I was certain in that moment that this is what television is supposed to do. Not distract people, not entertain them into forgetting. Connect them, bring them back to each other. Give them the moment they should have had and didn't." He paused. "If we did that once, if we were the room where that happened one time, then everything else we've ever done was worth it. If Ruth's story stayed with you today, if it made you think about something you accepted that maybe you should look at again, someone you gave up on, a truth that might still be out there waiting to be found, then look again. It is not too late. Ruth Simmons is proof. And if you want more stories like this one, stories that prove love is more stubborn than time, that truth finds its way, that some doors open again even after 37 years of being closed, hit that like button right now and subscribe. Every single week we find another story worth telling. And every single one is a reminder that it is never, ever too late for something true to arrive. We'll see you in the next one.